Cool. All right. Hopefully everything's good. Hopefully we're going live. As soon as somebody says we sound normal, mic check. I think we'll be good to go. Anything to drink this evening, my friend?
Actually, I have nothing. I'll have to. I'll just text my wife to tell her to get me a drink. I totally forgot.
It can't make me the only one. I can't. The status quo can't shift to me being the drunkard on the show. You've been gone for too long for that status shift to
I know.
happen.
I think the funny thing is that I don't drink that much, but I joke about it quite a bit. You know, when we bullshit online and I joke about it quite a bit. And it's starting to the point now where people even on the chats are saying, "Oh, Boom's drinking again." whenever I make a sarcastic comment, it's like, "Oh, Boom's drinking again." It's actually, no, I'm just naturally an asshole.
shout out Mark. Shout out Mark McKeever in the comments. I think that he said something like that fairly recently when you'd popped into like the live chat of another show.
Yeah, well, people have to understand that when you if you're a drunken jerk like I am and you sober me up, you're still left with the jerk. I mean, I'm just sober. I mean, come on.
Fair.
I mean, Does it really matter? Does it really matter if I offend you if I'm sober or drunk? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Also, when you're at your drunkest, I think you're probably just like the most friendly. Like just looking back at that night in the Irish Tavern, I mean, we were all pretty wasted. So there's that. But let's get on into the show, of course. I'll intro us in. We'll say hello to our adoring audience and get into it. So, hey guys, welcome to the 74th episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and another co-host in the comics community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium that is comics. Whether it be stories, creators, constructs, adaptations, we hit it all this week. I am rejoined by the one and only other half of this dynamic duo, the comic book Cape Crusader himself, Comic Boom, brother. It is a delight to have you back on the channel.
Great to be here, and I'm proud to be wearing the Area 51 Helix Project T-shirt. And I got to say, we're talking independent comics tonight, and of course, Trevor, you've got Area 51 Helix Project issue 2 is you just finished your Kickstarter, and I supported that, and I hope as many people watching did, and if they haven't, I'm sure you it's not too late to take advantage of it,
It's never too late, but always big thank you, man. Thank you for the support as always. Thank you to everybody that's shown this book support, and a shout out to everybody that took the time, energy, and frankly money to show support to my little sci-fi comic book, man. Always available. Issue 2 is going to pre-press right now, so we won't have physical copies of issue 2 available, but number 1 is readily available for you at DarkKnightNation.com/shop. You can pick up a bunch of cool merch like the one and only marvelous Mark McKeever did this week. So follow in his footsteps, check it out. Again, Dark Knight Nation merch, Area 51, the Helix Project comics, merchandise, all of those things, and issue 2 will be available there. Otherwise, if you like your comics on Comixology, you can actually check us out and follow us on Comixology, where issue 1 is already posted. But with all that out of the way, we'll use my little indie comic to segue into our conversation about how the industry is pretty much segueing into indie comics. It feels like a major balance. The big shift, I think, mostly comes from the fact that the precedent had been set for a very long time, that you do independent comic books with the hopes of building up a name so that you can then go to Marvel or DC and have a little bit more of a secure, let us say, footing in the comic book industry. Now, almost 30 years after the initial launch of Image Comics, we're seeing a resurgence in a big bad way. I've often said that modern day indie is carrying the torch for old school DC Vertigo. Bless my heart for loving DC Vertigo, because I just never get to have it. But we're starting to see a lot of these folks coming from DC and Marvel with established careers and refocusing a lot of their time and energy, and frankly, creating what I think has been almost unanimously higher quality content with creator owned. I don't know. Am I going crazy? Boom. Like, are you seeing this shift in the industry? And do you think it is a sign for something greater.
Well, I think it's obvious. I think we'd have to be blind not to see the shift in the industry. I mean, we certainly see the trends, the corporate adjustments that have been taking place with AT&T, with DC Comics, the layoffs, the Marvels, the fiascos, the storylines, the focuses. I mean, Marvel publishing more titles more than ever before, and my retailer is carrying less and less Marvel for the shelf than ever before. You know, I remember a day back in the 90s. You know, you were born in the 90s, so you may not remember this, but I will tell you this. I remember back in the 90s, I would go into a comic shop and I didn't need to have a pull list. I did have a pull list, but I didn't need a pull list in the 90s. There was always comics on the shelf in the 90s, and every comic that came out that month was pretty much on the shelf because the retailers got it. We're in a very different world right now, a very different comic book market, and you need a pull list. You need to have Batman on your pull list to guarantee you even get a Batman comic nowadays. It's pathetic, it's ridiculous, and the bottom line is that this is how incredible the independent market is, because indie comics are more popular than at least the bottom, I would say bottom 50% of Marvel or DC, quite frankly. They sell more and they're getting more hype and people are putting them on their pull lists. And here's the kicker. I happen to know that my comic book retailer, and I suspect yours is the same, and the people listening, comic book retailers more and more are putting comic books on the shelf that are independent comics. They're buying shelf copies of independent titles and fewer shelf copies of Marvel and DC for a very good reason, because they're just that much better. And just a quick note, I'll say this. Have you noticed that every time a superhero title tries to cross, you know, they always do a cross genre. They try to mix superhero tales with a horror title and mix a superhero idea with something else or a romance. And it rarely works for Marvel or DC. And yet, with independent titles, it seems to go over better and it seems to get better. It just seems to be something that we want. And you know, there's that old expression that there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And maybe, just maybe, independent comics, it's an idea that's been with us a long time, but it's finally starting to hit. We're finally starting to realize that, look, if we want great storytelling, there's only so far that superhero tales can take us.
Well, even then, you're starting to see these subversions of the superhero genre in indie. I mean, look at how successful Invincible has been. Between the actual comic book series itself and how beloved that was, its adaptation. You have Jeff Lemire's Black Hammer, and not to beat a dead horse, but like Watchmen, you know, arguably the greatest selling graphic novel of all time, all deconstructions of superheroes. So I don't think it's as much the superheroes. I think it's the people behind them and the people that hold the most control over those characters. That's where you're seeing the biggest problem, because to me, like my favorite, with the exception of maybe Superman, usually my favorite superhero stories are all kind of tied to genre fiction. Now, do you see a high level of consistent success with superheroes being in their own sort of genre fiction story? No, not really. Definitely, you know, I'll start your welcome home episode by saying yes, I agree with you to a very high extent, and I can definitely see the way things are shifting. But what I will say is that superhero comics aren't. I don't know. I don't think it's anything particularly against superhero comics. I think it's what the companies are trying to do with them. You know, what you're seeing in the likes of Jonathan Hickman's X-Men line, or at least for the beginning half, was just a really good sci-fi story. That's what it is. It's cloaked in X-Men. You know, it's not really traditionally superhero at all. And, you know, somebody want to call me on it? Yeah, I dropped that stuff. Mostly because it fell into the tropes of 22-part comic book crossovers. But largely, you know, it's good genre storytelling. So I don't quite know if I can put the blame on the title of superhero comics.
Well, let me add to that for a second, and I'll build on what you're saying, because I'll grant you that, well, we can't put the blame on superhero comics. All it takes is it all comes down to the writing. If the writing is good, we got great comics. I get that, but let me just clarify this more specifically. I'm trying to remember the last time there was an interview of a creator working for the big two that actually sounded genuinely passionate about the story that they were writing. And what a cynical thing for me to say. Oh my God, how cynical of me to say. But by the way, I can identify a couple. And I will say that passionate creators, DC took some less experienced writers, and they're very passionate. Stephanie Phillips is very passionate, and I love her writing. I love her passion for it, and that's a good thing. But overall, if you really want to look for, people have fun. If the creators that are passionate and creative and are having fun, they're out there in the indie market right now, and you can tell in the interviews, man, they're just flying high. They're flying high, and you gotta give, there has to be more editorial for the big two. I think for DC and Marvel, what they fail at is the lack of creating. I think they're clearly, I mean, they're going through so many growing pains or evolving pains that, in my view, we see, how often do we see this? We start off with a passionate creator at DC or Marvel, the big two, and then after a year or two, you can kind of tell they just want to get the hell out of Dodge, make a name for themselves, and then get out of there. Because I think it's a lot of them there. You can kind of tell they're kind of just staying there for the paycheck, and then they want to get the hell out. And hey, if you and the sad part is editorial. If you're leaving guys like I don't want to pick on anybody, but really leaving a guy on a title for 100 issues, come on, come on, really? I mean, change it up a little bit. I don't know. I'm just
I see where you're going, and I think that you make a lot of good points here. You're seeing a lot of people who are huge names that are totally setting their eye on telling their creator-owned story, and there are numerous reasons for them to do that. But speaking, I think most purely, they have complete creative control over their vision, right? In the same way that everybody got their Snyder cut in 4:3 aspect ratio, everybody gets to go to indie comics and tell their story. And you're seeing people not only start to kind of gravitate towards that on a scalar basis, you're seeing people do it completely. When's the last time Ed Brubaker wrote a story that wasn't something he wanted to do? When's the last time he wrote something for Marvel or DC? You're seeing all of these huge names that are now not only self-sustaining off of indie, but they're making more money than they ever have. They're telling stories that are infinitely more creatively fulfilling because they are theirs. And whether or not we want to make this a discussion about editorial, a lot of them hire editors who they have faith in, as opposed to getting stuck with an editor hired by somebody else, which I think all but guarantees a much higher level of cohesion. And you're seeing guys, for example, like Scott Snyder. We don't know what his next DC project is, but we do know he has 4 upcoming independent comic book series through his imprint, Best Jacket, that will pretty much all be published by Image Comics, as far as I understand. And let's just put the little cherry on top here. Nocterra is the best thing he's written in years. After 2 issues, by far.
Yeah.
What does that say?
Yeah. What you focus on grows, and people focus on what they're passionate about and what they're happy about. And one of the disadvantages of the big two, and this isn't even the big two's fault necessarily, is that the big two, let's face it, we are very hard on the big two. We scrutinize the big two. We're more likely to review a big two comic than we are an indie comic, which is unfair, by the way. We have a responsibility to review more indie comics because they deserve to be reviewed and get the light of day, not just these random talks like we're doing now. But that's changing. We're reviewing indie comics more and more. But with the big two, they come under so much more criticism, and that, to me, that has a psychological toll on the writers, and it just does. And I think it's good and healthy for guys like Scott Snyder to get the hell out of DC and do their own thing, so that they don't become jaded from our criticism of death metal, for example. I mean, because at the end of the day, I like a passionate writer, and I want every writer to be on their A game. And if that means you got to, you got to change up, you got to change your style a little bit and get away from the big two, so be it. That's what I like about this, is for once the market is really determining it. And also a shout out to the spec market, the comic book speculation market. As much as we can get angry at speculators, and I'm one of them because I'm both, the fact is that it's boomed the independent industry. So the whole comic book community, not just the readers, but the speculators, we're all coming together to support the indie market, and that's important too.
Yeah, and I just think that there's a lot more fulfillment to be had as a reader coming from indie. You know, it's ironic because if you caught me 3 years ago, maybe I was picking up 1 or 2 independent comic books. You want to know how big and goofy my smile gets when I realize that most of a week's pull are indie comics nowadays? It's a beautiful thing. And the thing that I find interesting is the way that these people, these creators, are incentivized to tell different types of stories between big two and indie. The last time, or maybe the time before last that you were on the show, we had a conversation about dismantling publisher bias, and there was a conversation about a statement made by James Tynion, right? Where James Tynion came out, and I'm paraphrasing, so feel free to correct me, and said something along the lines of, why would you reinvent the wheel or think outside the box when you don't have to? And I found that troubling, very clearly, but I also found it equal parts ironic and almost contradictory, because what he's doing in indie is actually kind of thinking outside the box. And I think that it shows a pretty discernible difference in quality between what he's doing at indie-wise and what he's doing at the big two. And just speaking as somebody who is a Batman fan, I don't like his Batman. You know what I do like a lot? Department of Truth. Something is Killing the Children. Wind. It's all really good. In fact, Department of Truth, I think, is probably like a top 10 book on the shelves right now. You guys should all buy it, by the way. So why is that? Do you think James Tynion's remarks are specifically toward work for hire, in the sense that you don't give them all the good ideas? Is it because of the potential of all these royalty machines that he's churning out? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, James Tynion, I'm sure you've read he does a monthly newsletter, and sometimes he pumps it out weekly, but it's very revealing about his thoughts, and it's very interesting. And James Tynion, he made the most significant comment he made, in my view, and this is me reading into his comments, so if obviously my interpretation could be wrong, but he made the comment at one point that he felt that some of the best, most classic stories were simple. That sometimes the biggest mistake writers can make is that they try to reinvent the wheel, and they try to get too deep, too far, too esoteric, and frankly, it just resonated with me when he said that. And I said this in a review I did with Chase at Comic Source of his Ghostmaker backup in Batman, which is a ridiculously simple tale, which plays with all kinds of tropes and introduces new characters for Ghostmaker. He's kind of like a glorified, sexual Bruce Wayne, unapologetic, and it's just a fun comic with all the gadgetry. He keeps it simple. And I really think that James Tynion has hit on a formula that works for him psychologically in his own mind. He keeps it simple. He just tells the story. And he's not trying, and because he's reached a pinnacle of success, he's just writing. He's just right. I remember Stephen King said one time, he said somebody walked up to Stephen King one time and said, "Oh, I always wanted to be a writer." And Stephen King said back to him, "Yeah, I always wanted to be a brain surgeon." And Stephen King's point was, if you want to be a writer, write. And that was the point. And sometimes I think these writers, they get too tied up, and that's some of the baggage with the big two. If you do get tied up with the characters, and you get bothered by the stress and the anxiety, and you don't know the history, and you're trying to find a handle on a character, well, obviously, if you have your own character that you've created, that you've had in your mind percolating for years, because I know you and I have talked, you've shared some thoughts with me on different characters. You got a Batman story you want to tell inside you. I got a Wonder Woman. I mean, you're passionate about it. And that's what the indie thing is. People are they have ideas and they're putting them out there. And thank God we got a medium for it. Thank God for Kickstarter, so you can put your truth out there. We got Indiegogo. I love this. This is such a good time for comic books right now. And the irony is, it's less of a good time for the big two.
No, there's a lot that I can nibble off of there. A lot that I agree with. See, I think the thing that troubled me most about that statement by Tynan is particularly the headspace that I'm in right now, because building this career, or at least trying to build this career, I'm constantly concerned with the idea of greatness and what greatness means. And when I look at the all-time greats, the people that you remember, right, as the best to ever do what they did, they all thought outside of the box. They all pursued this sort of Shakespearean idea of negative capability, which is most simply the sense of thinking yourself into such a hole that you can't get out. But the willingness to think yourself that far and that pursuit is what is valuable, and it is what generates the best art. And in my mind, I think that's where you get the things that end up on everybody's top 10 list, right? The Dark Knight Returns, the Preachers, the Sandmans. So what is that? I don't know. Maybe that's just indicative of my very particular circumstance that I'm in, and the pondering of greatness. But if you keep things too simple and you are so, I don't want to say occupied, when you're so content with staying, and this isn't in a derogatory way, this is air quotes, stupid simple. Can you make something great? Right? Can you make something great if you don't challenge yourself and or the reader?
Well, I would respond to that by giving an example, a very specific example. Greg Rucka. Greg Rucka has written some fantastic works. They haven't all been great, and yet some of his favorite works have not been well received. He writes Lazarus. It doesn't sell particularly well, and yet it's his passion. He dedicates it to his dad that died a couple years ago. He's wrote some passionate things about his dad in the back of Lazarus. I love the series. It's fantastic. Arguably the most successful thing that Greg Ruck has ever written has been, they made a movie about it. And it's, what is it? Old Guard. Old Guard. I mean, he wrote that almost as an afterthought. You should read his story when he talks about writing Old Guard. And you couldn't get more simplistic a tale than that. They're just a bunch of old immortals. And he asked himself a question. Oh my God, if you're 6,000 years old, imagine what type of person you'd be, what you'd remember and what you'd forget. And how do you hold yourself accountable? And what would life really be like? That would be a horrible thing, to be that old and never be able to die. And he just asked himself natural, and he wrote a story. And lo and behold. And I think that if he was to overthink that and say, "Wow, that's been done. that's been done." How cliche is that? Another story about an immortal being. Oh my God, how many does DC have? We got how many does Marvel have? How many? We got the Highlander in the movies. I mean, I'm not going to even bother writing this crap. But he did. He wrote it, and now we even got a third series coming out. Old Guard Tales of the Tales Through Time, which first issue hit this week. I mean, that to me is an example of sometimes when in doubt, just write. I mean, just share your vision. And I think, look, and I'm not a writer, so who the hell am I to tell anyone their truth? But as a reader, guess what? I love what Greg Rucka did. I love, and how many times have I been impressed by a simple story thinking, why am I enjoying this? Because it's so goddamn cliche and simple, and yet I enjoy it. But I got to tell you, I've read some Grant Morrison stories that I want to throw in the garbage because it's so goddamn esoteric and out there. It's like, what are you trying to do? Why don't you know what I mean? So to me, it's that sometimes you never know what resonates until you write the story, because writer after writer can tell you a story that there's, they sometimes the work they put the most work in doesn't hit, and the work that they put the least in or they thought wouldn't hit, it's popular. I mean, I don't
know. Yeah, but okay, there are a couple things where I kind of take issue with. And I think the fact of the matter is, you look at something like Old Guard and you say, yeah, if you put it on the most superficial level, how many stories have been told about immortals? Thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably, maybe millions. How many of them have told Greg Rucka's approach to something like that? And that's what made it good, right? Like simplistically or conceptually, yes, you can have vague similarities between a million different things. There are vague similarities between what is just sort of unanimously understood to be great and things that are unanimously understood to be trash. And I think it's the approach. And Greg Rucka, the thing that you can appreciate about him is the way that he networks out the story and forms his own web, right? That is unique to him, that sets it apart from those DC immortal stories, the Marvel immortal stories, or Joe Schmo's immortal stories. And I think in a way that is a sense of complexity, because there's this misnomer that like complexity means something that's difficult to understand. And I don't think that's true. I think complexity is often indicative of all of the different moving parts that are successfully working in order to curate the experience of the whole. And that's why I think you have so many different things out there that are complex and that people can enjoy for different reasons, right? Like we've had conversations, for example, on why I think everybody and their mom misunderstands Watchmen. But the central thing is that no matter how many people I might think misunderstand Watchmen, they all enjoy it. They all enjoy it for a totally different reason than I do. And I think that is indicative of the fact that it was a super complex story, but it's something that you can also enjoy on a simplistic level. So that's where I sort of come from, in the sense that I would rather somebody shoot for the stars and try to tell something that's thoughtful. But down the line, I think that if it's well done, it will be enjoyable by somebody that's just looking to engage with the material on a very basic level.
I want to refer to a comment John Thomas said in the chat. He makes a comment about Tom King, that Tom King was poorly received because he tried a new concept with the Batman, can Batman be happy concept. And he makes a good point, and that's sort of, I think, building on what you're saying, that there's no question that you can take a simple concept like that and you can fail at exploring it. I mean, and Tom King, arguably, I thought it dragged on too long with Tom King. You want to talk to another guy with a, thankfully it wasn't a 100-issue run. It was only 85 issues because, it was fired. But, you can go wrong with a simple concept, and you can do a simple concept and you can do it to death. But I think the important thing is everything starts off with an idea. And if the idea is simple, I mean, take, for example, Berserker. Now, I'm going to use this as an example. Boom Studios. Now, you might say, well, that's a little unfair because it's Keanu Reeves promoted this, so this is different. And I'm going to argue, no, it's not different. It's still an independent title. It's still a Hollywood movie star. Really, what does he know about writing? I mean, maybe he's written a screenplay. I don't know. I don't care. This concept is ridiculously simple. It's about, surprise, surprise, a guy that can't die. Another immortal story. Boy, another one of those. Why are we interested in this? Another immortal story, and who makes a deal with the U.S. government saying, find a way for me to die and I'll be your secret weapon. That couldn't get more simple. But like you said, okay, now let's get into the head of this guy. Can this concept be a character-driven tale? That's what's fascinating about this. And what are the consequences to it? And there's something about independent titles and the passion behind these writers here is that they can go in whatever direction they want, and they're not going to be limited by a corporate mentality that's going to restrict him and force him to be a character that never develops or grows, which unfortunately is like a lot of the corporate titles for DC and Marvel.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a slightly separate point from what we were discussing, but yeah, I mean, there are certainly like the corporate tentacles that wrap around you in this sort of, I don't even want to call it a necessity, but certainly these corporations will frame it as a necessity to keep these characters untouchable or so for sort of statuesque in a way, right? Where you can't really make any big differences unless they're characters that nobody cares about, in which case, yeah, I guess they might give you the time to do it. The problem is that I think that oftentimes the stuff that people might consider simple, but also simultaneously achieving the status of great, are perhaps more complex than people are giving credit for. but it just appeals on multiple levels, is what I'm saying. And that when you look at, again, the grander scheme of the industry, when people talk about the greatest comic book stories ever told, the greatest stories ever told, there are layers of complexity. But the thing is because they are told in such layers, you can access whatever layer you feel comfortable with, capable to do so, what have you, right? Like you look at the greatest films of all time, The Godfather, most simply is a really interesting mob story. Next layer down, it's actually kind of about family. Next layer down, it's actually a discussion about PTSD occurring in the real world. Next layer down, it's actually all of these things. And you get to the point where you create something that is so eternal, right? Like people are going to be talking about The Godfather 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And at this point, it's been almost 50 years since the first film came out, and it's widely considered to be one of the greatest films of all time. So I think that is also indicative, regardless of medium, to comics, to prose, to whatever, is that it is complex. And because it is a well-fulfilled complexity, it's not that difficult to access. And I think people are afraid of the word complex as to whatever sort of connotation or implication they think that may carry.
Yeah.
But we've definitely spent a lot of time sort of debating the idea of the complexity and or the simplification or the maybe just the purity of idea that goes into indie. But I think that there are a number of reasons as to why a lot of these big name creators are starting to funnel their themselves creatively, energetically, what have you, into indie. And another part of that is well brought up here by Mark McKeever. He says, we know that indie comics is enticing for talent because of the control and the money from their property. It's getting away from toxic fans, the big two, social media, and other factors side of the indie work. Let's approach that first part, because that was originally something I did want to discuss, is the control of property, right? When you're working for big two, you're creating something for somebody else. Aside from the creative restrictions, you don't own a part of that pie. In fact, you own you don't own it. They pay you. As if you might have owned a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. But hear me out. When you're making an indie comic, you could sell 1/6 of a book at the big two and be making more money as if you sold the book 6 times higher in sales volume at the big two, and you get royalties on the back end. And then you begin to look at adaptation. And with all of the success that you're seeing, where these streaming companies are getting desperate for content, the indie market is just bountiful. Aside from the millions of things we've heard about being optioned, right? God Country, something we're both very fond of. Undiscovered Country by Snyder and Soule was optioned like before the book, I think, actually came out. But looking at what's actually seen success, let's talk about those elephants in the room. The Boys, Kick-Ass, The Walking Dead, Umbrella Academy. I would also argue that at this point, the Invincible animated series is highly successful.
Certainly. Yeah. Old Guard too, like that we just mentioned. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. There's the image is at the forefront of so much of this. And it took a while, but one of the things, and this is something that all the creators at Image, they're learning, a lot of them are learning the hard way, is that, Hollywood's taken notice, and Hollywood has, I am told, and I just know this from what I've read. I got no experience on the legal side of doing these types of contracts, but I'm told that Hollywood has taken advantage and kind of screwed over. And if Hollywood has a movie in the works that is similar to a comic book, that's an independent comic, they'll just buy the rights to the independent comic. It's cheaper to pay the writer $100,000 and then never develop their work. And so that's one of the you want to be very careful of. I think it was Kelly Sue DeConnick one time had given an interview about how important it was to make sure you have a good lawyer who, because if you're ever approached, if you're an independent writer and you've got a semi-successful or look to have a successful comic book, you want to be very, very careful if you're approached and let's say you're offered $200,000 for the rights, all the rights to your character. That might sound like a lot of money if you're broke, but hey, maybe you might want to just consult a lawyer and maybe not give up all the rights for it. And it's definitely something that it's a quagmire there that, because people, I think because so many writers, and I even look at yourself because I know that you're passionate about Area 51 and it's a great comic. And right now you're just at the beginning of your career. And I mean, I'm sure, if I was to tell you right now, I'll give you 200, I like your concept, give me proof of concept. And after our first 2 or 3 meetings, and I work for Warner Brothers or an independent studio, and I offer you 150 grand for your, for the full exclusive rights and full control, what would you do?
No.
Well, fair enough.
And to be fair, though, that no comes off of the broken backs of at least 100, if not more, other creators that got taken advantage of in this situation. I'm fortunate to have heard things tangentially or direct from sources, where people are talking about all of the intricacies of licensing as opposed to rights and all of the different aspects that by creating an intellectual property in any medium, but specifically in comics, how that spans out, right? Because you have your video game rights, your film rights, your TV rights, your prose rights, merchandising rights, dude. Those get split up into at least a dozen different categories. So lo and behold, say you came to me with that offer for my merchandising rights and put it as the general blanket term merchandising rights, I'm selling away 12 different categories of my pie. So, that there's something important to talk about there, but there's if you are financially literate and legally literate, at least in that specific space, there's a lot of money to be made. You're seeing this generation now of creators that are now a little bit more sort of literate and adept to those sorts of things, right? Like Kelly Sue. Although we might not have heard of anything of hers getting out there into the sort of film adaptation space, that she's probably been paid multiple times to option some of her material, which if anybody doesn't understand, an option is basically a studio or a company paying you to say, hey, we're going to give you this money for X amount of time. You give us first pick at your property in terms of adapting it. All it means is that from this date to this date, nobody else can even touch it. I can't negotiate with anybody else about it. That in and of itself, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people, privately through interviews, what have you, where they've talked about properties that have been optioned 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times just for the potential and them not fulfilling and following through on picking up licensing or what have you. It's a whole nother beast. It gets into all this legalese that frankly I don't speak. You know what I mean? But it's
I like Jace's comment. He says that you got to take the money, Trevor, and then never sell another concept. What the hell? Take 150 grand if you got all these ideas in your head. Take the money and then drop everything and
I think I'd first of all I might reach out to Kelly Sue for some advice. But I think at that point, just from my perspective, I would work in different aspects of the contract, right? So like one of the things that I'm sort of I start to think about now, just knowing that it is a possibility down the line, is how can I get myself more involved in these adaptations, right? Is somebody paying me 200 grand, 150 grand for the full rights to my property? That's a steal for them. My idea could be absolute shit. And 200,000 ideas for complete rights to something like that, knowing that they have the resources, is a steal. I know a lot of guys. We talked about Rucka earlier. One of the things that he often will work into his adaptation contracts are that he is a writer in the writer's room and or the showrunner, which not only means that he gets creative control over the adaptation, which is a whole nother sphere of being satisfied, but you get paid for being a writer in the writer's room. And it goes, there's so many layers beyond like what I could even possibly understand at this moment. But that's why even now, knowing that I'm a broke college kid with going on 2 single issues of comic books coming out, even at that point, selling something in totality for $150,000 to $200,000 might seem like something that would be a no-brainer, but under all of the different sort of ways that I can make my property viable, that might actually be a steal for them on any front.
Sure. Yeah.
So it becomes this whole game. But you look at these independent publishers, and now one of the things that creators are looking at are the relationships that these indie publishers have with studios. From what I understand, one of the hottest things about going to Skybound right now is that they have a very good working relationship with Amazon. What does that mean? You publish a book with Skybound, you immediately have Amazon's eyes on it. What does that mean? Distribution of and production of not only an adaptation, but of merchandise. And mind you, merchandise usually makes up the lion's share of any intellectual property sales. That's why do you think Marvel Studios isn't that concerned with getting Spidey's film rights back? They don't care. You want to know why? Because they got the merchandising rights, baby. You know what those merchandising rights make them? Somewhere close to 15 to 20 times what the film rights will make them. And it's an easier product with a lower bar to cross in order to produce it. So we're getting a little bit far from the comic book talk, but that's kind of like where I'm coming from in that angle. But you look at the point being, getting back to the central focus of the conversation, is all of these big indie creators that are now hopefully and a little bit more likely to be wise to the growing pains, that comics being adapted to larger media have garnered, are now able to make very successful careers off of having one moderate hit of a property. I recently saw something where Jim Zub was talking about his Image series Wayward, which he will agree it was a sort of moderate success for Image. Yeah. He still makes more royalties off of that than he does it for all of his combined work at the big two. That's huge. That's a huge incentive for these creators, man.
Yeah, no, and I got that entire series Wayward by Jim Zub. I actually like it. I've got a surprising number. I even got some original art from Jim Zub, of all things, back in the day. But in any event, yeah, it's just an incredible. The independent market is just so extraordinary right now, and with all these creators, I'm just astonished at how it's so wonderful that they have a venue by which that they can do that. Thank God for Image. Thank God that Image, and I'm blaming, it's not just Image. It's like Dark Horse. All of them are. There seems to be a better contractual relation. Something must have changed to make it more appealable to all these creators, because more and more of them are coming out of the woodwork and they're being attracted to Image. And I mean, good Lord. I mean, back in the day, would a big time writer ever want to do his own series? I mean, right now, Snyder, Jeff Johns with Geiger that just came out. I mean, wow, this is a great time to be a comic collector, man. And I got to tell you, and and thank God somebody's picking up the slack here. Somebody's picking up the slack, because, I'm thinking, I just saw the preview, to give you an example, for Jupiter's Legacy, with Mark Millar for Netflix. That contract that Mark Millar signed with Netflix. I mean, that was huge. That's something that, in fact, I don't know. Has anyone signed a bigger deal than Mark Millar? I think, wasn't that the biggest deal ever? Who's ever made a better deal than that? I mean, you'd have to go with Kirkman. Maybe Kirkman's Walking Dead deal with AMC maybe was a little better. I don't know the details, but I think Mark Millar, man, that's wow. I mean, that's really, people always talk about Kirkman's deal with The Walking Dead, but again, and let me just focus on Kirkman one thing. Kirkman's done such a great job that he's got The Walking Dead, he's got Firepower, which is also going to be another one that I think is going to really take off at some point. He's got a series called Die, Die, Die. He's got Invincible.
Your mic just got disconnected.
Yeah, all these titles that back in the day, very few people were collecting. I got issue 24 to 144 of Invincible. I love it. But Robert Kirkman, he stays consistent. He didn't reboot and renumber. He avoided all the bad things that the big two are doing. And it's paid dividends for him. And yet, goddamn, the big two continue to make the same mistakes again and again and again and again and again.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that just now, having read comics for a while and being so entrenched in the culture, the biggest frustration is that these companies have existed longer as entities than anybody else in the industry, and they continue to make the same cyclical mistakes and wonder and wonder why they're not seeing true increases in sales. Way back at the start of the pandemic, one of the things we were talking about when DC had decided to kind of give Diamond the boot was, well, wouldn't it be kind of stupid for DC not to make a relationship with a big trade publisher like Penguin? And here we are a year later, and Marvel makes that relationship. You look at something like that, and DC not looking at the way they're limiting their market and what is to gain from truly having the distribution network of pros is insane to me. Because let me tell you something. I tell somebody I read comics. Yeah, might kind of get a giggle. Hey, I read graphic novels. Oh, really? Graphic novels.
And you make comics too.
Right, but it's as if there's something entirely different. You package comic books into something a little bit thicker, frankly. Like, we'll just talk about this really superficial metric of it just being a thick book instead of a floppy with perhaps a more thoughtfully designed cover. Well, you put that on stands, people are going to buy it, and I say that as somebody who, 2 years ago, I won a debate where I argued on the side of collecting floppies as opposed to graphic novels. And now I'm in the exact opposite camp, by the way. I'm all for reading the graphic novel style. So, or trade paperback, collected volume, whatever, however you want to word it. Mm-hmm. It's a weird, first of all, it's a weird freaking game of semantics, but look at the mistakes that the big two are making. Certainly these larger independent publishers have made their mistakes, right? Like Image is one of the, and I love Image more than anything else, more than anywhere else right now where I'm feeling I would like to publish with Image one day. If you said, Trav, you can go publish with Image or go publish with DC Comics right now, I would say Image. No matter how unrealistic either one of those two things are right now. So take this with a grain of salt. Image was a foundational part of the collapse of the comic book industry in the 90s, apart with DC and Marvel. But what happened? They made that mistake. And they are far from making it again. As opposed to DC and Marvel, that are all about millions of incentive foil cover, gimmicky, Peach Momoko Yo Mama covers. Like, look at the difference. And I'm curious, man. I'm hoping you have an answer. Why do you think the big two are so much more predisposed to making the same mistake multiple times, as opposed to an indie publisher making it once, maybe twice, and moving on?
I'm guessing it's pure economics. The DC and Marvel they cushion the blow by sheer volume, and they got more popular characters, and they got more popularly renowned characters that they get. If an independent title can't weather the storm with some bad publicity, and they generally, there's a certain amount of, I think, healthy self-pretension to an independent writer who does things outside the norm. Look at ENIAC, look at Bad Idea Publishing. Look at them. They're doing things demonstrably different, and those are well-known good writers, good creators. They're doing something different, and they've been criticized. Some people are thinking they're making their mistakes, but they're sticking to their guns. They've specifically said, this is what we think is wrong with comic book publishing, and this is what we're doing. And that creates respect by us, the buyer. Respect. Unfortunately, my retailer is not cooperating with that idea and isn't ordering their product, but still, my point is still made that the big two. I think Marvel and DC continue to pay a heavy toll, and they're paying it right now. They're paying it right now, and they continue to get diminishing returns. When I'm trying to think, for example, I call it the Ta-Nehisi Coates effect, or I can and I don't mean to pick on Coates, but let me give you an example. The last time I collect Captain America comics for one reason only: the Alex Ross covers.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. I haven't read a Captain America comic since issue 12, and from what people are telling me, the storyline hasn't ended, and the most publicity Ta-Nehisi Coates gets for his Captain America was recently with the Red Skull fiasco, because it's some sort of political issue off of Jordan Peterson book 12 Rules for Life or some such nonsense. I mean, this is what constitutes good writing for the big two. I mean, when you got to do something controversial to get noticed, as opposed, whereas with an indie comic, you got you get creators that say, look, this is what we're doing. We're like I said, they often think outside the box. They tell good stories, and you get no BS. You get no BS, and you get no a billion variant covers, and it's just, bullshit walks. Bullshit walks. And there's less BS in the independent market.
Yeah. No, I mean, I get what you're saying to a certain degree, because controversy is going to sell regardless, and you're definitely going to see controversy and or spectacle or an attempt to appeal to that everywhere. Unfortunately, I think it's more the big two have populated their line with spectacle for spectacle's sake, and we've had that conversation numerous times, so I won't beat that dead horse here. But I do also want to approach something that I know Skip and Tosh and Jace are kind of discussing about the sort of benefits of Image. From what I can gather, the nice thing about Image is that not only do you maintain full creative and control and full ownership over your product, is that you will be able to use whatever resources you have available to you financially off of the success of the book. And in some situations, they will pay you advances in order for you to be able to fund the production of the book. You have access to that network, right? Once you have made that association with Image Comics, you have their entire network of people that they associate with that they can get you in touch with. And those connections in and of themselves are very valuable. For example, they have a relationship with different printers immediately as a company. Image Comics as an entity. What does that mean? You now pay less per unit in general. You now have a much easier ability to use their service, build up your unit count, and continually lower the price of production. You also have their networking with creators that are already heavily involved. You can get in touch with people. That is hugely valuable, especially just me looking up there from my little spot here on Earth. There are also numerous resources in terms of their marketing. And again, I guess this falls outside of Image Central, because Image does have its own studios, and the different studios do provide different resources at a cost, whether it is intellectual property, money, what have you. But I think that being associated with Image in and of itself opens up a number of doors, as opposed to something like a Kickstarter, where you are now not only your market is too broad, right? When you go to Image, you're selling it to people that are distributing a product to a specific group of people. Therefore, the average onlooker is much more likely to purchase your product, right? Like, if I've learned anything about the basic marketing of Kickstarter and whatnot, the big problem is you actually want to have a fairly focalized audience that you are trying to expose your product to, because the likelihood of exposure per the population and the likelihood of conversion is much higher. So I don't know. I mean, I guess none of it is really set in stone as to what you can gain from Image, and it depends on how. I don't know. What's the word I'm looking for? Intuitive, I guess, the individual person is, but there's a lot to be gained simply by making connections with people at Image that know other people, and all of those connections will kind of surmount into a resource that is holistic, whether it's distribution, marketing, editorial, design, what have you, right? So, you know, personally, I think that there's a lot to be gained from something like that. But let's see. Try to approach some of these live chats here. Samoki Dude finds the term graphic novel distasteful. Interesting. I'm kind of unaffected by it, but I guess I can understand where you're coming from. Tahila wants to know what manga I've read for inspiration. A little bit outside the topic. All I'll say is that visually, I enjoy Junji Ito's body horror for the sake of suspense and tension and sheer horror that you can evoke with as little words as possible. But I don't want to get too far into that.
Well, although I would say though that in a very real way, manga is certainly a form of independent comics. I mean, because I've been told repeatedly that I should be reading manga because everyone loves it. It grossly outsells comic books by huge numbers, and that's because it's and when's the last time you heard about a manga cover? You know, I mean, is there a speculation? Is there a secondary speculation market in manga? No. People buy manga because they like the stories, period. And they're good and they evolve the characters. And that's something that, quite frankly, I would say the independent market is trying. It's sort of like a crossbreed between a manga and the big two, in that you're getting better stories, but you're also getting some of the covers. You're getting better covers and you're getting a little bit of the speculation as well. Anyways.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the thing, is that I don't really know all the legalese about manga. Like, I know, for example, Shonen is the highest selling collection of manga in the world right now, and I'm vaguely sure, or I'm fairly sure, that there is a larger entity that has some level of control over the shonen material. So I don't know. Like, I don't really want to dip my toes too far into that conversation, because it'd be ignorant of me to do so. But so my question is, like, at this point, we've talked about this sort of vacuum, and it's not a complete vacuum, but it's certainly gravity, taking these larger creators towards indie, and even these smaller creators that are just kind of content staying in the indie market. We've talked about why indie might be appealing creatively, financially, socially, even. But the big question here is, man, what does this mean for the future? Is this just another peak in the oscillatory nature of the comic book industry? Will we go back to a moment where the big two are the absolute and indie is just indie, and known as nothing more? Or is this a trend for the future?
Well, obviously that's a tough question to answer. I've always thought that the comic book industry overall has been cyclical for the big two in terms of what's popular and what isn't. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and make a prediction, and that is, I do think this is a trend for the future. I do think the big two are going to continue to go down more and more and more. And I think the quality is going to rise to the top of the independent market. I think that the bookstores are going to start taking note more and more. I think that it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Penguin. Penguin is something that's developing with all the distribution through Penguin House. Who knows the impact that might have in terms of the bookstores, in terms of what might be coming out. I do think that I think the writing is on the wall. How many times have we bitched, whined, and complained? And I think legitimately so, not just after we've been drinking or during our drinking, that, a corporate mentality generally never seems to bode well for the creative process, frankly. And, even all the great Marvel movies were based on source material source material created by creators in the old days of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where they had fun and were underpaid, but they just wrote the comics because they loved the medium, not because they were getting paid the big bucks. It's all about the passion and the creativity. You want to follow a trend, show me the passion, show me the creativity, and I'll show you where the trend is going to go. And that looks to be the independent market.
Yeah, I mean, I say this all with a grain of salt because I've been reading comics now for really only 7 years, and that's such a blip in the comic book industry, or it's such a blip in the history of the comic book industry. What I can say is that I fervently hope that what we're seeing now, this direction that it seems to be going in, is a trend. And I will always be beholden to the characters that Marvel and DC have. Always. I I have tattoos of characters that I will probably never get to write, that I could from very well on never read a good story about ever again. But they're icons. So let me put that out there with a grain of salt. But for the health of the industry, I think that seeing the indie market thrive will provide not only a level of security, but a level of growth, the likes of which this industry hasn't seen in a very, very long time. And you're seeing it. You're seeing independent titles by larger creators, like we'll put that out there, selling 50,000, 70,000, 90,000, 100 plus thousand copies again. Spawn, and I don't even like Spawn. Spawn is consistently selling in the top 10 again. What is that telling you? What are people looking for? But what that also says is that those numbers are so much more sustainable for these guys because they're not doling out all of these little bits of pocket change to a million different people in the corporate ladder, right? Like, who are you handing out money to? Whoever you need to produce the material, the creatives behind it, whatever the cut to the publisher is, distribution. 4? Like I know I've had a lot of whiskey tonight, but is it just 4? Like, is my math good? Like, it's really so much. It's just at this point in the game, it's becoming more and more intuitive. If you can figure out how to build your audience, you can live a sustainable career as a comic book creator, selling 5 to 10,000 copies consistently of your little indie book, as opposed to selling 60 to 80,000 copies of some character that you don't have, that you don't own. And I'm just talking publishing. I'm not even talking the potential for adaptation or option. So it's huge. And I think that you're beginning to see better stories told by these creators that are not hindered by these corporate tentacles that are wrapping around their necks. They're able to actually have fun producing this material, right? Like, speaking sheerly as an aspiring creator, the thing that I've come to value, especially now knowing that I don't really have any financial gain, is knowing that I'm telling something that is creatively fulfilling, right? Because when you create something, you're putting a piece of yourself into it. Now, how many times do you think creators have tried to put a very particular piece of themselves into a book, for better or for worse, and been told, absolutely not, fuck off, by the big two? Probably a lot. For better or for worse, again. But they can do that in these books, and they can make it theirs. And that in and of itself, I think, although is not of financial value, is of a great personal value. So my last question before we wrap up, just because I'm a DC Vertigo ho, is that I've often said, and I said it in this conversation, that it feels like modern indie is really carrying the torch for old school DC Vertigo, in the sense of comic books that are of an independent mindset, that are told with a higher level of authorship and care, and, for those that might disagree with me, complexity. Now, there's also this conversation about how cyclical things are, and many, myself included, I've said it in the past, that DC Vertigo will be back one day, because comics just don't know how to let anything die. But my mind is beginning to shift, because when you think about how successful indie has been in picking up that Vertigo torch, and doing so while letting the individual creator own the torch, right? As opposed to them carrying a torch that is ultimately owned by Warner Brothers or DC. Does Vertigo have a place anymore?
Well, it could, except I'm going to give a really cynical answer. I just think that it's the corporate mentality of AT&T and is simply that owns DC Comics. I think they're too tied up with politics and the identity politics and everything else, and I don't think they understand. I think they lost sight of what actually independent writing is. They lost sight of that. DC Vertigo used to be a place of ideas. It used to, with Karen Berger in the heyday of Sandman and the golden years, fantastic titles came out. And I will give, even during some of the more critical years with Andy Curry and what have you, and there were some controversies and stuff. And even the reality is that you have to take chances, and you have to give the benefit of the doubt to the creators. That's what Vertigo always did, and that's what attracted people to Vertigo. And I mean, Neil Gaiman. I mean, good Lord, this is a guy that, I mean, even Bill Willingham with Fables and with Why the Last Man with
Ryan Vaughn.
Thank you, Brian Vaughn. I mean, this is the stuff that was just this is epic stuff. This is great stuff, great materials, but I don't understand. I mean, if you think about it, what would be the sole reason why? I mean, if you really wanted to be at the forefront of at the forefront of creativity, why would you get rid of Vertigo? Why would you do that? Now, they got Black Label, and maybe Black Label is their de facto Vertigo, but why get rid of Vertigo unless you're just concerned about the bottom line and the corporate mentality of the big of the Trinity, and maybe just concerned more about focusing on your bigger intellectual property? Just seems asinine to me. Maybe you have an answer for that.
Here's why, man. They just can't compete. And I've heard it out of the mouths of multiple pros. They cannot give you the same deal that you can get at an Image or a Dark Horse or a AWA Upshot or whatever, right? Like, because of that corporate structure and all of the different ways they are funneling money out of these properties, they can't give you that deal. You don't own a piece of the pie. You don't even get a freaking fraction of the money that is due to you by creating something, as opposed to going somewhere like Image, even having the basic network that Image provides, right? People that also work with Image, that somebody that you correspond with at Image can get you in touch with on that super basic level. You don't have that. I mean, you have their marketing, but it's very clear that DC, Warner Brothers, whatever name you want to give that massive spicy conglomerate, they're not going to give you that time of day. But a company that focuses on independent comic books, well, if you have a pitch that is interesting and or you've built a name for yourself, you are the thing that they're going to invest their time and effort for. And guess what? You're going to be marketed to an audience of people that already want exactly what you're trying to sell, as opposed to something, even through DC. Yes, you might have the name DC Vertigo, but a lot of people come to DC just for the superhero stuff. That's a whole nother conversation. Is that bias, right, that inherently comes with, nah, it doesn't have Batman in it, I'm not reading it. Mind you, I was that guy when I started, so I can speak with an unfortunate level of knowledge about being that person, because I look back on that and I cringe. But
it's like they're biting their nose to spite their face, though. I mean, my point still stands that if they can't compete, that's a choice. They absolutely can compete. They can change their contractual provisions with creators. They could have saved Vertigo. They could have changed. They could have changed their contract. They could have changed for the good of the industry, and arguably even for the better of themselves, with a little bit of sacrifice. I mean, if you really think, DC Comics would kill for some of the success that Image has gotten. And Image is just a publishing company, as Jace has pointed out in the chat. And I mean, seriously, you think of all the bad press that DC has gotten, especially near the end of when Vertigo went under, and even some of the bad press of Black Label and the fiascos and the editorial nonsense. And everybody remembers Batwang for God's sakes. I mean, this is all conscious, contractual, stupid choices made by editorial, and there's no excuse for it. That's the bottom line. And, we're having this discussion, and I'm just, okay, you're a creator. I'm just talking as a fan. And let's face it here, DC has made a mistake. And I cannot believe that when that you can't allocate some money. I mean, even law firms have a pro bono department, for God's sakes. I mean, take a little financial cut for the betterment of the industry and for your own PR. I think it would go a long way. But hey, I don't know.
I think the problem is that those business decisions are made by people with corporate eyes, and ultimately, you look at comics as such a niche market, and it is. They're not meant to be looked upon with your corporate eyes, Warner Brothers. They're not really. It is such a low profit industry. And I'm not saying that as a dig. It's just, it is what it is. The profit margin on comic books are not very high in and of themselves. Again, spans in all these different licenses and merchandising and all that BS. But the problem is, again, these decisions are being made by people that see the $1 billion that DC Comics might make as pocket change.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, because Jace makes a good comment. We should probably both be careful what we're saying. He says I should, instead of saying DC, I need to substitute AT&T, because I think you and I can both agree, and we should clarify that there are a lot of people at DC that probably feel the same way we do, but their hands are tied because AT&T, they call the shots, and they're probably given some corporate direction. And because there's probably, at least not everybody at the old DC was fired. I think they still have some of the old editorial teams that are there, but it's just par for the course. I mean, it's just unfortunate that the playing field was leveled like that. And I don't know if AT&T, I'm not minding DC right now, but it does seem to me to be a little bit unfortunate that the corporate mindset is, they're not learning from the independent market. The independent market is showing them the way. They're showing them the path. But their ego, it's almost like the corporate ego is getting in the way, saying, no, we're the big two. You got to do it this way. Well, no. Independent market is making them look stupid.
What's almost more insulting is that they've shown themselves the way. They've seen huge success critically and financially, and then they go back and implode in on themselves, right? Like, yeah, they're watching it from the sidelines. They can literally go watch fucking old, what's the word I'm looking for? Old like family reunion videos and study themselves. Like that's all it takes. They've seen massive success. And yeah, times are going to change and you might need to reformat it to the time that we live in. But the basic premise, the basic approach is pretty much always going to be the same. And that's, I think, what is offensive. And yeah, I mean, I just honestly, I'm so bad at keeping up with live chats. I didn't get that far down yet as to see the replacing DC with AT&T. But even then, let's be real, DC has been making these mistakes these cyclical mistakes, might I add, far before AT&T bought them out. Right. So maybe in certain situations, these things are indicative, are a product of AT&T just not knowing comics. But even prior to that, I think a lot of these mistakes were unnecessarily repeated by people in the industry that I even admit to respecting, right? Like for all of the back and forth and the criticism and whatnot, I have a huge amount of respect for Dan DiDio, man. I have a lot of respect for that guy. More than most people in the industry. I'd probably like to interview him or sit down for a conversation with him more than almost anybody else currently working in comics. Not only because he's super passionate, but because I'd love to pick his brain. And he, with all of that respect being given, has repeated mistakes that were not only his predecessor, but his own. So that's where I have a hard time kind of pulling it too far away from DC Comics as an entity and affording that more towards the larger corporate structure, when even the publishers isolated do these things. And again, I think what Boom was saying just kind of makes it icing on the cake, is that they're seeing their contemporaries with far less resources thriving. Imagine what they could do with the resources they have, with the amount of sheer clout that has been afforded to them. I guarantee you, as much as we've talked about the likes of Ed Brubaker and Brian Vaughn not writing for the big two, if somebody came up to them and gave them a good enough offer, whether it was creatively, financially, whatever, they'd go back. They'd go back. And like you said, Boom, the biggest problem is they're either not willing or they haven't figured out how to do it, which is the shame. But I do want to end this on a good note in the fact that indie comics are freaking thriving. I'm enjoying reading comics now that I've focused more of my attention on indie. Now, perhaps more than ever. Maybe with the exception of DC Rebirth, because DC Rebirth was great. It was excellent. But I've never enjoyed reading more than I do now. So yeah.
I agree. I agree with you. And I haven't enjoyed reading. I've enjoyed reading more than ever before lately. And I will say to end, getting to the end of my comments, that I really like. I want to give a shout out to the cartoon Invincible. I want to give a shout out to Robert Kirkman and to what I think is the future trend, and I think in a healthy trend, and that is Berserker with Keanu Reeves. Getting high profile Hollywood supporting comic books and showing that they can be successful. I think it's going to be a potential wave of the future. Because I think it's getting more profile out there. I mean, just think, Invincible is going to be, a future kid's Superman. People are going to look back on that Invincible cartoon and say, oh, wow, remember that? Your average 10 or 11-year-old probably shouldn't be watching Invincible because it's kind of violent. But I mean, let's face it, it's the wave of the future, and it's all independent. And, I'm sure people are going to start taking notice, and the studios and the streaming services, more and more, we're going to be getting these types of cartoons, these adult takes, intelligently done. The animation is done differently, and all flowing from the inspiration of independent comics. So get in on the forefront, because the comic books that you love now, independent, will be the future IP that our kids and future generations will be reading.
Yeah, no, you said it really well. They're not caught in the jungle of all of the legal BS that these properties that are owned by Warner Brothers, Disney, what have you. Yeah, I knew you were going to enjoy that.
I love that name.
Yeah, it's a great name. Great name. And this person has been actually really, really great in my comment section. So for the sake of not getting totally messed up on YouTube, I just say the Sea Commander, but they've been a great member of the community. So many thanks. But like you said, man, these IPs are showing that they are commercially viable. And that was the biggest problem. People looked at indie comics despite the almost unanimous understanding that the quality of the material was better. They looked at them as superheroes' stupid younger cousin because they weren't financially viable. And that game has totally changed. We're in a different space now. We know that that's not true. And now, not only can you make a product that's viable on this highly financially successful level, but also you can tell something that's creatively fulfilling. And as a creator, as somebody who is working now to put out books, let me tell you, when you put something out into the world that you feel satisfied by, there's no greater feeling. There is no greater feeling than somebody talking to you about the thing that you wrote and telling you how it connected with them. Nothing better. So I can only imagine how people that are doing it more successfully than I am, that are running into hundreds, if not thousands of people that love their work, how valuable that level of fulfillment is. And that's powerful. So at the end of the day, I think just the beautiful thing is that if that indie comic books are thriving in such a way that I think they can sustain the industry in a whole new way that we haven't seen before. They're learning from their mistakes. They're drawing in the names. They are hoisting up the unheard talent so that they are heard and generating a great product, to be frank. So the end of the day, I want to thank everybody so much for watching. As always, you guys are a crucial part of the show, and we would not be able to make this without you. Of course, it was. Please give a warm round of applause to my conversational partner in crime tonight. It was good to have you back on, man.
Yeah, no, it's good to be here. I know it's been a while. It's just lots going on, and other things happening, and yeah, it's good to sort of get back in the groove, and it's good to be here. And shout out to Jason, Joe's Geek Show there, Mark, everybody in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
I do a weekly thing with I collaborate with Jason. We review DC Comics weekly, so hope people check that out from time to time. And I'm gonna be doing a review of Soul Finder Dark Tide that'll be coming out this week, and I'll be interviewing Douglas Ernst, the writer of that. And in probably the next few weeks, I'm scheduling a time with that. And check out Jace's interview of Stephanie Phillips. I'm not sure if it's going to be posted tomorrow, but I hope to be part of that. I'll have to talk with Chase about it. I'd like to be a fly on the wall and learn from the master and how to do an interview before I do my own. So any event.
Yeah, for sure, man. Yeah, it's great having you back on, of course. Yeah, make sure you guys go click the links in the description. Go check them out. You can also find the link to Jace's on a number of Let's Talk Comics episodes where he makes an appearance. So if you want to go check him out as well, just go click the playlist, find a video where you see the Comic Source logo. There'll be a link there. Of course, Boom's link is in the description below. Go check them out. If you haven't already, make sure that you click the like button to let us know that you enjoy this type of conversation. Make sure that you subscribe. We are literally a scrotum hair away from 750 subscribers, which means that we're getting pretty close to 1,000, and I have a lot of really cool giveaways at 1,000 subscribers for you guys, including prints signed by the likes of Greg Capullo, graphic novels, hardcovers, prints, all of these shenanigans. At some point in the near future, I'm going to be moving to New York, and there is no greater audience of people that I would rather downsize my stuff to. So make sure you stick around. I've got my Geiger review coming of the Jeff Johns, Gary Frank, and Brad Anderson's newest and biggest independent outing. Again, another huge creator that's spent a lot of time over at DC that's seen the light, but we'll figure out how that went. Make sure you go back, check out my last couple reviews. I have my Nightwing 78 review, which is the first outing of Tom Taylor and the new creative team on Nightwing. That is really close to hitting 4,000 views. So do me a favor, help me push it far enough. Nocterra #1. I have the number one Nocterra review on YouTube. Let's keep it that way. Let me be #1 for once. God damn it. So thank you guys again. I appreciate it. Make sure you check out all the parties involved, to our wonderful live chat, Tevya, Mr. DC Comics, Joe's Geek Show, Jace the Comic Source, Skip and Tosh, the Sea Commander, Samoki Dude, Mark McKeever, JT Gamer, Bill Maker. If I missed anybody, I'm sorry. I've had a lot of bourbon tonight. Thank you for being part of the conversation. And we'll catch you guys next time on Let's Talk Comics.